examining efforts to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. I see we still have some participants joining us. I'd like to ask you to introduce yourselves in the chat box, please, and give us your names and the organizations you work for. We have interpretation in French and Spanish. So click on the globe at the bottom of your screen. Choose the language, French or Spanish, that you'd like to listen to during the event. I see we still have people joining us. We have a very full agenda, so we'll get started. Welcome once again, everyone, to our event on examining comprehensive sexuality education as part of efforts to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. This event is sponsored by the Interagency Gender Working Group. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you to introduce yourselves in the chat box, stating your names and organizations and where you're from. Once again, we offer interpretation in French and Spanish. If you'd like to choose either language, click on the globe at the bottom of the screen. Next slide, please. My name is Francesca Alvarez. I'm a gender policy advisor with PRB, the Population Bureau, and I also co-chair the Task Force on Gender-Based Violence, which is also run by the Propel organization with USAID. We have several colleagues with us today. It's a pleasure to see you with us today, especially as you are engaged in global events during the 16 days of activism on gender-based violence. Comprehensive sexuality education is based on decades of evidence and is also focused on the facts about gender-based violence. We take a holistic approach to preventing violence among young people. We include how to build on this prevention and response, and the role of CSE, as well as their effects on school programs. We'll hear from our experts, our panelists, and we'll continue our discussions after this webinar with you and with colleagues. Next slide. Before we dive into our session today, I'd like to highlight our safeguarding commitments. We are committed to ensuring that our learning and knowledge exchange events are safe, supportive, and inclusive. We will be discussing gender-based violence, a topic that can be difficult, and participants are encouraged to take care of themselves. Participants are also expected to engage with each other in a way that does not intimidate, threaten, harass, exploit, demean, or otherwise harm participants at our virtual and in-person events. If you experience harassment or other harm during this learning event, you may report the conduct using one of the following mechanisms. To the email address listed here, or to the FHI 360 Ethics and Compliance Hotline. The IGWG-GBV Task Force will not tolerate violence or abuse of any kind during this session. Any participant who violates these guidelines will be removed and will not be allowed to re-enter the event to participate. Next slide. We have a very full agenda with lots of participation. The key points and recommendations from today's event will be shared with you after the event. So we're going to have Dr. Avni Amin, who is WHO's Technical Officer for Violence Against Women, to open. Then we'll move on to a presentation on UNESCO's guidelines for the prevention of gender-based violence. Remy Chawa from UNESCO will give this presentation. This will be followed by a panel discussion on the opportunities, and then we'll have a question and answer session with a discussion. And finally, we'll end the event with a closing and evaluation. I just have a few housekeeping reminders. Once again, we offer interpretation in French and Spanish. So, if you click on the bottom of your screen, you can choose which language you'd like to listen to. We encourage you to use the chat box to share your questions and comments. If you have any questions or audio problems, please send a message in the chat box and we'll help you solve the problem. Next slide. So we have a very short, quick activity to get a better idea of who's in the webinar. We've got 2 survey questions, so my colleague is going to launch the first of these questions. So first question, what best describes the main area of interest in your work? Do you work on gender-based violence? Do you work in comprehensive sex education in both areas or neither? Choose the answer that best suits you. I see that participants are still answering, so I'll give a few more seconds to answer this first question. All right then, so it looks like we've got about over 40% who work in the field of gender-based violence, and 29% who work in both, and 17% answered neither. For comprehensive sex education, we have a percentage of 11. Thank you for answering this question. We'll now move on to the second survey question. So for this second question, it should be displayed on your screen. The second question asks, how familiar are you with the relationship between comprehensive sexuality education and gender-based violence interventions? Are you very familiar, somewhat familiar, or not at all familiar? Choose the answer that best describes your situation. The answers are still coming in, so I'm going to give you a few more minutes to answer this second question. All right then. So it seems that a majority of participants are somewhat familiar. And 22% are very familiar. 19% not at all familiar. So, I think we have a lot to learn from this webinar. Thank you for taking part in this survey. I think we can stop sharing. And We'll now transition into a presentation by Dr. Avni Amin from WHO, and she's going to give you an introduction on how to respond to the problem of gender-based violence using comprehensive sexuality education.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'd like to share some knowledge about the facts and issues of gender-based violence that we've gathered with our partners. I'd like to summarize what we're doing to prevent gender-based violence, and I'd like to highlight programs to prevent and combat this violence. Next slide, please. So, speaking to the respect framework, we've defined the interventions we've implemented. And we've developed 7 strategies. The first strategy concerns the intervention for skills strengthening. Another is women's empowerment. A third is to ensure the provision of a range of services. Fourth, intervention to reduce poverty. The fifth is about making environments safe, including schools, workplaces, public spaces, and so on. And then the 6th is working with children and adolescents to prevent abuse. And the last category is transforming attitudes, beliefs, and norms about relationships between people. What we found is that many of these interventions are safe, for example, for the environment or child abuse prevention. That's what's most useful, but I'm going to talk about that in more detail. But I wanted to present our interventions in a very general way. So, under each of these, we find many examples of interventions, and if there's more than one evaluation, it shows an important intervention on violence prevention. And we categorize evidence with a green square to show that there has been more than one evaluation that shows improvements. For example, in knowledge and attitudes, but not necessarily in behavior. If there is conflicting evidence, they are highlighted in yellow here, showing contradictory results that aren't very clear, or if there isn't a very clear evaluation of the interventions. So we've created these categories and we've presented this summary table for the different countries, in particular the LMIC category, which stands for lower middle income. And it's also a way of giving you a very general overview of what we're doing in terms of intervention in this field. Next slide. So if we look at interventions in schools, here you see actions to prevent abuse. And there are 2 categories of intervention that I wanted to highlight. The first is school-wide intervention, which concerns the school's policies on sexual harassment and specific forms of sexual violence, and we make sure that it also works with parents. The second category is interventions that are curriculum-based, to provide training for the prevention of gender-based violence, and we're going to talk about this in more detail. We want to talk about the right to play, but within certain standards for preventing gender-based violence. Next slide. So, here, we're going to talk about what we've evaluated for different interventions and what we've found to be successful in reducing violence. If we prioritize the survival of women and girls, it's about promoting attitudes of tolerance and respect based on human rights. And many of the interventions targeted demographic segments that suffer a lot of discrimination and problems, and in many cases there were several different interventions combined. And so, it's a more global point of view here. So, this is what we call the guiding principles for effective programming of interventions to see which ones work best. Next slide. So what we see here on comprehensive sexuality education is that we understand that it's important to respect the core components. That's the key to reducing violence. The second lesson is intensity and duration. This is what we call in public health the fact that the dose matters. A single intervention that doesn't last long won't produce good results. Interventions must be repeated. They have to be constant and regular. We need to train the people involved to ensure that everyone can participate in these programs. Recognize that changing norms and behaviors is important. But we have to be realistic and plan for training periods that last a certain amount of time. Contextual factors are also important, because if you use an intervention at one site and try to replicate it elsewhere, it may not work if the context is different. So it's very important to have a combination, a fusion of interventions, so that interventions can be diffused, and so that we can see what's happening in different places, not just at school, but also parents and people outside the school need to be trained too. We need to change not just attitudes, but behavior, and this needs to be measured. And what we've found is that changes in attitude often don't translate into changes in behavior, and that's very important. Next slide. So, what are the lessons to be learned from gender-based violence prevention in schools? Successes include training in nonviolence as a means of conflict resolution and demonstrating that behavior change is real. Next slide. So when we look at the comprehensive sex education component of preventing gender-based violence, we see that there are many elements of successful gender-based violence prevention, including modules on relationships, values, rights, understanding of gender differences, issues of violence, as well as the promotion of skills for sexual and reproductive health. And as Francesca mentioned, there is evidence that we need to take action in this area to create partnerships to combat this problem. But one of the things that the Gender Working Group is showing is that there's a lot of work to be done, and we need more evidence. Next slide. So I'm going to ask you some questions here for the group to consider. Firstly, the high school curriculum in particular, which is administered, must adhere to the principles of fidelity and quality to combat violence. Are these changes sustainable? What types of violence are affected by this program? Physical, sexual, or psychological violence? Because we need to determine which types of violence we want to combat. What are the basic components or modules that produce an impact? What are the other aspects of school-based programming? Not just the curriculum, but also services and parent involvement would be necessary to reinforce curriculum-based learning on violence prevention. Is it effective in the whole population, in all segments? And the question here is that we know, we have evidence. We need to make sure that when these programs are implemented, they have to have an impact, and that impact has to be measured to reduce gender-based violence. Thank you, and I'm done. Thank you, Avni. Now we'll move on to a presentation by Rami Chawla from UNESCO. Thank you very much, Rami. Thank you for introducing the debate. And we're going to try to talk about sex education as a strategy to prevent gender-based violence. So, let's start with an overview of the teaching process on the cognitive and emotional aspects of the problem. What I wanted to say here is that it's important that with our American colleagues, we talk about sex education. It's very limited because you have to go beyond that and appreciate the context of comprehensive sex education. It's much broader than what's often presented because it's about cognitive development, aspects of physical development in our lives and interactions with our own sexuality. We're trying to equip children and young people with skills that will enable them to realize what they can do and to understand the need to respect dignity, to respect each other, and to develop healthy relationships with others. It's the choice they can make. It's their responsibility to make those choices, and it also helps them understand and protect their rights throughout their lives. Comprehensive sex education is a fundamental component of education at any age for children. How are we supposed to get results? It has to be based on scientifically precise and accurate data. It has to be based on science. It has to be incremental. We learn things at every age, and you have to build on what was learned when the child was smaller, and develop it as the child grows. So it has to be included in the school curriculum, but it goes beyond that. It has to be something comprehensive that covers all aspects of life. Everything we mentioned in the definition of comprehensive sex education, the social aspect, the cognitive aspect, the physical aspect, and so on. It also has to be based on a human rights approach, based on gender equality. It has to be contextually appropriate and transformative. These are very important elements of this comprehensive sexuality education, and it has to transform the way we behave towards each other. It also needs to be targeted at life skills for making valid choices. This is
what we call a prevention sequence, particularly in our regions. So what is the terminology used for CSE? What's really clear is that different countries use different terminology. So the job for practitioners, experts, activists is to really maintain the idea that terminology is going to affect understanding. And these effects are mutual. And due to issues of context, of course, this will have an impact on the choice of term for each country. So here's an example of what we have in the CSE's technical guidelines for education. We have a comprehensive test of key concepts. Topics and learning objectives that are adapted to the program and in most cases to the national level. The learning objectives are age appropriate and they become increasingly complex according to age and developmental ability in the four groups. So, we've got the 5 to 8-year-olds, and this age group, what these students are going to learn is going to be quite different from the older ones. We have the concept of skills for health and well-being. That's going to be a very impacted group of concepts. It's all going to be different by age. Again, 9 to 12, 12 to 15, 15 to 18, and every decision you make as an individual will have a consequence. The decision of who to play with, which peers to play with, the peers who bully us, and the health consequences, the negative consequences. All this has to be taken into account. For the 15 to 18-year-old group and beyond, understanding is going to be very different. This will have very different consequences on decision-making for the individuals themselves and all those around them. Next slide. So, the 7 key concepts of sex education described in ITGSE can be linked to violence, including gender-specific violence. ITGSE, for example, includes concepts of relationship dynamics, whether healthy or unhealthy, stigma, and discrimination. In terms of violence and safety, we need to recognize the different types of violence, including sexual violence, consent and privacy, and online violence. GBV can be an entry point for CSE in contexts where sexuality can be a different subject to discuss. We've seen this in the context of the African continent. The moment we open up CSE and analyze it, present it, whether it's for policymakers, religious people, we see that CSE helps prevent gender-based violence. Next slide. We know that, according to the Global Status Report, for the countries that reported their result, we have just over half of the countries that reported including content on gender and gender norms. love, relationships, and sexual abuse or violence as part of science and technology education. Next slide. So here's an example. If you look at the particular topic of gender-specific violence and the learning objectives for the different age groups, if we look at the 5 to 8 grade group, the key idea is that it's important to know what gender-based violence is and where to go for help. We have all sorts of elements for this age group, as well as the key idea. For older children aged 9 to 12, the key idea is that all forms of gender-based violence are unjustified and a violation of human rights. I think the key message here is that if we look at the international guidelines, the content becomes more and more complex as the ages increase. Next slide. Here's an example related to consent and bodily integrity. The key idea is that everyone has the right to decide who can touch their body, where, and how. Next slide. So, CSE can contribute to the prevention of and response to gender-based violence in a number of ways. We've discussed such as consent, violence, and how and where to get help, attitudes such as empathy, respect, positive communication, values, as well as the school's overall approach in terms of pedagogy, references, school environment, etc., and how the school environment is important for students. Next slide. Preventing, mitigating, and responding to gender-based violence through education requires a whole school approach. This means, for example, the role of political decision makers with regard to reform, the importance of existing laws and policies, and systems for preventing violence. But what does it also mean to make a difference? Are we doing the right thing? Do we need to dig deeper? Do we need to involve more parents, for example? Partnerships, participation, and empowerment are also key. Programs, teaching, learning. We need to cover the whole curriculum and include the school environment, which plays a very important role, as well as the students' physical and psychological states. So, what does the new data say? Under certain conditions relating to content and delivery, CSE shows promise in preventing violence, including gender-based violence. CSE that includes clear content on gender and power, is particularly effective, including in creating conditions conducive to the prevention of gender-based violence. Recent research has shown that CSE helps to reduce gender-based violence. A recent UNESCO study highlighted the critical links between foundational education for health and well-being and protection skills. Next slide. So here's an example. On Connect with Respect, which is a school program to prevent gender-based violence in schools, developed for the Asia-Pacific region. It's a partnership between UNESCO and UNICEF, Planet International and WHO, and is currently being adapted and deployed in Eastern and Southern Africa. The target group is learners in upper primary and early secondary school. It has been designed to help students understand concepts such as gender, violence, gender-based violence and rights, as well as promote social and emotional learning and skills for respectful gender relationships. It also provides detailed guidance for teachers and instructions for activities. This will be rolled out in Malawi and also in other countries in the Asian region. So it's designed to help students understand these notions of gender, of violence, and to be able to have respectful relationships. When we did a pilot project, there was a shift in the percentage of students who knew how to seek help for someone affected by gender-based violence. Next slide. What are some of the key findings? So, a holistic approach that encompasses various components, such as gender, sexual and reproductive health and rights, prevention, and response to gender-based violence. CSE also empowers individuals by providing them with information and skills that enable them to make informed decisions about their bodies, relationships, health, and well-being. CSE promotes gender equality, challenges harmful stereotypes, and encourages respectful behavior, contributing to a culture of nonviolence and respect. Preventing gender-based violence is a good entry point for CSE in rights-hostile environments. There's a need to build on the evidence base on the GBV-related outcomes of CSE, and how we can have an impact on the delivery of this method. Thank you very much. I look forward to the conversation that follows. Thank you for your presentation, Amni. I've learned a lot about prevention and response to gender-based violence. We'll now introduce the panelists. I'll take a few minutes to introduce our moderator, Dr. Avni Amin. Next slide. Dr. Amni works in the WHO Department for Prevention and Violence Against Women. She leads work in this area. Her focus is on research for interventions to prevent gender-based violence. She is a passionate feminist and a scientist who is very committed to gender equality issues. Thank you. Here with you.
What I'd like to encourage people to do is to use Zoom's Q&A function, and then I'll make sure those questions are put to the relevant panelists. To give you a very quick introduction to these panelists, the first is Shama Bulangis. Thank you, Francesca. Shama is an educator on violence against women. She started working in this field at the age of 14 in the Mindanao region of the Philippines. And she is now the youngest member and coordinator of the Global Civil Society Reference Group for the Spotlight Initiative to eliminate violence against women and girls. She is also co-chair of a group of activists working to transform education and ensure gender equality. Hosted by the United Nations. The second panelist is Jeannie Ferreras Gomez. She is responsible for gender and youth issues with UNFPA. She has been working in the Dominican Republic since 2012. She is responsible for this program, and she's done a lot of work in Argentina too. She has several university degrees. The third panelist is Sheena Hadi. Sheena is executive director of Ahung, a non-profit organization in Pakistan, which tries to help young people, in particular. In 2001, she obtained a master's degree in biology from Amherst College, USA, and then a master's degree in developmental psychology from Harvard University. Thanks to her experience of working in Pakistan, she has been able to participate in various international working groups, promoting the fight for respect for sexual rights and sexual and reproductive health. The last panelist you've heard from is Remy Shawa, who is Senior Project Manager for Health Education at UNESCO. He is based in South Africa. He provides guidance on comprehensive sex education, combating school violence, and bullying. Previously, he worked for Sonka Gender Justice, the World AIDS Campaign, UNHCR, and UNAIDS. So, welcome to all these panelists. I'm going to start with the first questions, which I'm going to ask first of all to Sheena and Remy, and you each have 3 minutes to answer. And I'm going to remind you at the 2-minute mark that you've got 1 minute left, okay? So, don't go over your allotted time. So, my first question goes to Sheena. Sheena, tell me, what have we learned about specific sexual violence prevention interventions to integrate into the school curriculum? And how could this be strengthened to have an even greater impact? So, 2 questions. You have 3 minutes each to answer. Sheena, you have the floor. Thank you, Avni. Hello, everyone. So I think a lot has already been said about comprehensive sexuality education and specific sexual violence. But what I'd like to talk about is that the program to combat specific sexual violence includes work on gender relations. And you have to work not only with girls, but with boys too, to redefine the concept of masculinity. But the program could also focus on particular aspects of this violence in the specific context. It could be discrimination against groups with specific genders or domestic violence, so all sorts of things can be included. And we need to use this program, these interventions, to help people with health problems, for example, HIV prevalence, an unwanted teenage pregnancy. So, you have to, as we talked about before, there are many other aspects of health, of well-being, of human rights, on empowerment. And so, there's a question of quality, but also skills development, including conflict resolution, negotiation, decision-making, and critical thinking. And these are key issues in challenging gender stereotypes. So, we know that gender inequality is the cause of a lot of the behaviors we want to change. It's really at the root of the discrimination and violence that we see. So, I think there's a big overlap between what the different programs, these two programs are doing, fighting gender-based violence and comprehensive sexuality education. So, we want to change behaviors, and these behaviors are the consequence of discrimination and gender-based violence. We have to take this into account, this whole context. We can't work in a vacuum. We have to take into account all these norms, all these behaviors. And one key thing we should remember is that these programs must support actions to transform people's behavior. And we have to take age into account, adapt them to the context, because I know that in Pakistan, very young children, an 11-year-old girl, you can say, I can go to school, but only it's my brother, who, at 5 years old, walks to school with me. So it's clear that girls suffer discrimination and threats of violence very early on, when they're still very young. So we have to develop these programs when the children are very young and when they start to understand the problems. And the earlier we start, the better. And we need to be able to have these programs that complement and support each other. Thank you, Sheena. Remy, would you like to share your thoughts and maybe tell us what you think about this? Yes. Thank you very much. I think Sheena really spoke very well about this issue. I just wanted to add and underline the importance of transforming gender norms. We've seen efforts to combat gender-based violence, but we need to go beyond that to change behaviors, norms. We don't have much time, we have to act very quickly, but we have to act on the education system. It's difficult to change an education system, but we need to integrate this into our behavioral changes, especially for young people, for teenagers, when they're close to adulthood. And it's important to see what's happening in schools, even elementary schools, not just secondary schools. And so, we need to develop comprehensive sex education programs, and we need to provide the necessary support for people, teachers, and parents who are acting in this area. Young people need to know where to get help if they need it. And I think Sheena talked a lot about that. She's right. Is that there are regions that have different problems and context matters a lot. So you have to adapt these programs to the culture of the different regions, depending on the challenges. I think this is very important, and we need to look at the types of violence, the forms of violence that need to be changed and prevented in certain age groups, in certain regions. Is it just physical or psychological violence, harassment, or intimidation? We need to take action to affect a particular group. Thank you very much. You've talked about challenges. And our next questions now for Shama and Jeannie will be related to these challenges. And perhaps from an implementation point of view, Shama, if you can perhaps think about those challenges and how to address them and how to act on them to integrate comprehensive sexuality education into the whole of education for children. Thank you. Yes, I think I'm very happy to help solve this problem in all modesty. I know a lot of people here are experts, so they know the situation. I'd like everyone to give their point of view based on your experience in your own life. I'd like to talk about my context in the Philippines, in the city where I live. A few months ago, we started the first research on gender-based violence in schools, in my city, in my region. And the first thing the teachers tell the children is that there are no reports of harassment or gender-based violence. But what we have learned, after organizing a survey, is that at least half of the girls have been victims of human violence once, 50% have been victimized more than twice, and 25% have been victimized 3 or more times. So it's a real problem, and it's in both religious and secular schools. And so there is a need for sex education. But what we're seeing, there's more confidence to talk about the problems in secular schools than in religious schools, because talking about abstinence isn't enough. And that's what we only do in religious schools. So, when we talk about attitudes to gender equality, for young people, teenage girls, is that action has been taken, and teachers are working hard in this area, but it's not necessarily enough. But what we can understand is that young people also learn not only at school, but outside of it. Because if the teacher says nothing's happening here, it's clear that we have to go and see what's going on outside the school too. So, we need to train teachers to be able to pass on messages, to help young people understand the problems, and to help and support them, not only in school, but outside school. But how can we incorporate this into the program when we know that the programs are already very full and there's no time for that? So we need to find an organizational system to integrate comprehensive sex education into the program, and it needs to be taught so that children can benefit from this information. Comprehensive sex education shouldn't be isolated. It has to be integrated with the other points. And teachers teach a lot of things, do a lot of things. It's not just teaching their subject. You don't teach the history of geography or a specific field. No. You have to take social issues into account, and there are a lot of things that can be done to make sure that teachers have time to have opportunities to help, to provide assistance to children, to teenagers, and the government has to play a role too. When we start talking about prevention, what we see is that in the direction of health, in the direction of education, you have to cooperate with these organizations. We need to get them to appreciate and prioritize this comprehensive sex education, because often these are people who prioritize science, technology, or other things, employment, but not necessarily these norms that we're trying to change. And what we see here is that it's good to teach these things, but we also need to train young people, not just to learn specific subjects, but also to behave well and be a person who respects others. That's very important. And finally, I'd like to say that when we try to incorporate comprehensive sex education into all these interventions, I think that, honestly, When we try to do specific sexual violence programs, often it's not limited. There's no prevention, it's all after the fact. So we have to make sure we're aware of the problems and act to prevent this violence rather than just to remedy it. And the reason there's not much connection between women's rights science and these programs is that you have to connect, you have to integrate comprehensive sexuality education with the fight against gender-based sexual violence. It is important to break out of these silos, to combine all these things, and to act in concert in our respective contexts. We know the connection, but often there's no concerted action in this area.
I'll stop here. Thank you very much. Avni, I think you are muted. Yes, excuse me, I've got a bit of a sore throat, so I had to cut my mic. Thank you, Shama. And Jeannie, I'm going to ask you the same question. If you could tell us about the practical application and implementation of these prevention programs. Yes, hello everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity. In our experience, one of the lessons we've learned is that the challenges we face is the lack of tools and methods to implement prevention. How do we implement all these key concepts based on international guidelines? And so, the question is how to put these methods into practice to deal specifically with violence. UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund, has designed a toolbox for use in communities and schools. And this toolbox offers conceptual resources for prevention of gender-based violence in schools. And while offering support to teachers, support for young leaders who work with young people. This has been developed, and as Sheena said earlier, this approach to CSE also includes gender issues and rights, the effects on health and well-being. This toolbox is presented as 4 dimensions that allow us to reflect and put into practice. The first thing is to be civilized. We have a number of examples of young people dealing with different kinds of violence. We did a study, and it helped us to understand these stories of conflict. And we propose that educators can use the indicators of gender-specific violence. Then, the second argument is, how do we think? How do we perceive the situation? There's a list of activities where we present the feelings and expression of thoughts to provide a conduit, a channel for transmitting all these messages. The third step is what you need to know to prevent gender-based violence. Here, we work on the different frameworks by offering solutions on how to deal with the problem. How to transform these situations of gender-based violence by proposing how we're going to engage with prevention and how we're going to behave when faced with a situation. So, we have 7 stories illustrating different types of violence and so we have different ways for people to find solutions. So countries in the region can use these methods. I hope you find this project interesting. We can continue to talk about it. I'm available if you wish. Thank you, Jeannie. It's important to highlight the importance of having tools to translate different methods for the program and for teachers to use in practice. We've got lots of questions in the chat box, but I have one last round of questions. I'm going to ask you to direct the questions to each person, but could you take a minute to think about the future and share? Each person will do the same order, Sheena, Shama, and Jeannie, to talk specifically about what are some of the future opportunities for integrating CSE into gender-based violence programs and how program participants can include this in their work. So you'll each have 2 minutes, and then I'll move on to the questions in the chat box. Sheena, would you like to start, please? So I think the best opportunity we have, and I think this is a very opportune moment as we reflect as a global community, is to ask ourselves why we haven't really made progress on gender-based violence. And to do this, we need to reconsider a vision for the future. Is it just a question of literacy and numbers? Or is it the notion of being able to achieve a healthy life and the well-being of children? All these things are critical, but I think they need to be centralized. I think we're still lacking evidence in some areas. Firstly, there were a lot of important points raised by Shama, such as teachers. We depend too much on teachers. We need to find other ways. We now have new game-based projects. These are play-based projects to see what we can get as evidence, so that we don't just rely on what's happening in the classroom. We also need to look at the results. And how we can involve the health sector to make sure that children are doing better, that they're making progress, that their well-being is improved. And finally, we really need to have a multi-sectoral approach. Every challenge we face on a global level, whether it's climate, health, humanitarian, everything is based on and seen from a gender angle. So, for the people who work on the program as well as the people who fund it, I think we're missing the ability to make an impact in this area. Yes, Avni, your microphone is cut off again. Please excuse me. I'm turning my mic off because of my throat, but go ahead. Remy, I think that for the future, there are opportunities to really look at research and evidence by doing surveys in the population. And in schools on the forms of violence that are prevalent in different contexts. We have surveys on violence against children, and it's cheaper in the country to be able to do these surveys. Particularly by integrating gender issues and ensuring that we measure this element. We also support program revisions using the CSE assessment tool. To see how these different components are integrated into programs. I think this is something that most countries can undertake, as well as scaling up responses to gender-based violence. Shama, thank you, Avni. So let me speak as the youngest person here, and a feminist. So as a young person, I know that the reason I mentioned earlier, a lot of these young people learn this outside of school. So for example, there are the influences through TikTok and the various social networking platforms. We have to find a way of working with the creators of standards. And frankly, today, it's the social network influencers. So, maybe consider a social network influencer where we can integrate learning about CSE and explain how this can help. And I know everyone is learning or talking about prevention, but it's something that maybe that's an approach we could take. And that's the feminist in me saying that. Very often we focus on the technical things. Yes, we need the data, the hard facts, but the change, the movements then, are the ones that will bring about change on the ground. And when we don't leave anyone behind, it means we also have a good base to build on. And very often, the funding of organizations tends to separate and create silos. We need to have a space for collaboration between the different organizations in the field to create this kind of mentoring between organizations. Thank you. Yes, that's really the future, TikTok. That's what I'm learning. Back to you, Jeannie. Thank you, Jeannie. So, I think it's quite clear that when we talk about CSE, we need to think about how we're going to bridge the gap in service provision for teenagers. I think we need to think about how we can bridge that gap to meet the needs of adolescents. And that means making sure that these services are age appropriate so that we can better address issues of gender-based violence, especially when we're talking to teenagers and recognizing that they're in relationships that include issues of gender-based violence. And we don't always think about the young women, the young boys, who need to have these kinds of services to combat gender-based violence. I think it's also an opportunity to tighten that up in terms of services for teenagers.
Of course, school programs are important, but there's more to it than that. So, now we have a lot of questions in the Q&A session, and over the next 10 or 12 minutes, I'm going to ask you if you have any questions. You don't necessarily say who you want to ask the question to, but if you want to specify which person you want to ask the question to. The other option is to type your questions in the chat area if you like. So, one of Ella Hilton's questions is, how can we solve the problems caused by cultural, religious, or social issues when you're developing a school program? So, who wants to answer? Who wants to start? Sheena, I know you have a lot to say about this, since you work on the issues and expectations of public and religious authorities. Yes, indeed, I would have a lot to say about that. Yes, as I work in Pakistan, of course, there's a whole range of cultural and religious norms that we have to work with. But the key to that, and this has been mentioned a number of times already, is that you have to think about the local context and act accordingly. So we have to make sure that this context is taken into account when we develop a school program for children, but it has to be adapted. Case studies, references, and opportunities need to be localized. There have to be lots of stakeholders involved within the school administration, parents, religious leaders, and also the children themselves, student representatives, for example, so that everyone can contribute to the development of the content of this program and how it's presented. That's really essential. So I think there's a very strong link between effective program localization and program preparation, which strives to incorporate these changes in norms and behaviors and attitudes. I'm talking about the local organizations on the ground that are going to act, that are going to influence change and help meet the challenges. And we have to recognize that we may not be able to do everything ourselves. Sometimes we have to negotiate to be able to get a certain amount of money or time as well and the necessary people, but we have to try to find ways and use technology to the maximum. Yes, Avni, if I can add to what Sheena mentioned, I totally agree with what she said, of course. I think one of the things I wanted to add is the role of government. In my context, to answer that question, in the Philippines, there are laws that are very good. There's a law on reproductive health, comprehensive sex education. The Department of Health has a program on violence prevention. But it's not enough because it's not necessarily applied locally in the towns. But the money is there. The legislation is there. There are modules. Everything is there. We use the advice of international organizations, so we have to act, but we have to act locally, as I see in my local context, where I still work. How can we ensure that these national or international texts are applied? And how can we take action, convince members of the town council, for example, or school leaders to take action? That's what we're trying to do. We're talking to the people in charge of education and health at local level to force them to work in this field and to work together. We need to see what the government is doing and what it should be doing differently. We have to make sure it has the tools it needs to take action to prevent violence and change behavior. We have to take action. We really have to promote these ideas, taking into account the context, but above all, we have to act at the local level. That's what's important. Thank you. In fact, the term localization has many different meanings, but it's important, as you said, to work at local level, with local communities, to adapt programs to the realities on the ground. That's very important. Now, I'm going to ask one more question. From Stephanie Torland. Behavioral changes are possible in the long term, and when emotions are often involved, when we change attitudes and behaviors and interventions, if they are technical, rational, they really have to match. We have to act in such a way as to combine, to conciliate the two, so that we incorporate all this, that everything is concerted and combined, so that we use information, rational actions, and also take into account feelings and subjective issues. Would anyone like to answer that question? I think that the right thing to do is to seize the opportunity, to develop a strategy that helps people think about the situation and consider what they think, what they feel, and how to act. So I think that one of the things you have to do is make people understand that there are different groups, different demographics, but also different ages, different age ranges, and you have to see what people think, their opinions. That's the first thing, to position yourself and help people understand where they are in their life, at their age, in their culture, when you see violence. So, ultimately, when you apply the 4 steps we've talked about, you have to start by saying what you feel, and perhaps how to act in different possible ways, depending on the local context, how to react, and how to remedy cases of violence. So, I agree with what you said at the beginning. It's very important to bear in mind that when you organize an intervention, you have to take the context into account. We've had some very positive experiences in developing methodologies, virtual toolboxes, and this has helped us to take action. Because it starts by forcing people to recognize their point of view, their culture. Yes. Would anyone else like to add anything? No? Very well, I agree.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead, Shama, if you'd like to add something. I don't want to talk too much, but when we talk about emotions and the subjective side of eliciting good reactions, it reminds me of this project we did. It wasn't really supervised properly. We didn't have enough data. It's really a question of young people's attitudes to gender. But I think we have to learn from these failures, and teachers could learn from this. We need to bring together artists, people who write, journalists, and create books for children. Created locally, by teachers, by writers, by artists locally, and then we distribute them to children, and we give them to public libraries or schools, school libraries as well, to try and get people to understand, young people to understand self-respect, the need to respect others. And so, if it comes in the form of a book, it can be very positive. It can help. Of course, there won't be all the data in these books, but it can give young people a way to think, to question themselves and see what they could do differently, and it could be a good start to doing something about it. Yes, I see people who understand, who agree with you. Yes, that's important when it comes to thinking about and helping young people. You have to integrate this into context. FPR example. It's important to get them to talk about their personal stories, their experiences, and to see what resonates with people. It's very important to allow people to express what they think. We've got 4 minutes left. I don't know if we'll have time to answer all the questions, but I'd like you to take a little time to answer them online. Through the chat, question, and answer function. And I want to see if there are any questions currently in the chat. There's a lot. Support, it's amazing, for everything you've said. I'm looking. Yes. There's a lot of resource sharing, which is very helpful. So there's a question. We could perhaps reflect on
About
how to talk about, to understand, to take action, and to fight against gender-based violence on the basis of local culture. I don't know if you want to look at this question and answer it quickly. We've got about a minute left, and then I'll give the floor back to Francesca. Yes, if I can say something quickly, I think it's important for us to understand the different forms of violence. Men, women, boys, girls, many people suffer, but in different ways from violence. It can be physical, emotional, or psychological, so there are different types of violence. It's important to remember that boys in schools are subject to violence, perhaps even more so than girls. So it's important to take account of that, of these differences, of the different forms of violence we're trying to reduce. I think there are a lot of interesting questions. It's important to provide comprehensive sex education for both boys and girls. It's important because it's for all genders. It's not just for girls and women. So we need to take action, find ways to implement these policies, continue to encourage government, local authorities, community organizations to take action to ensure that we can bring this to everyone. We need to take into account all the nuances of violence experienced by different genders. There is homophobic violence, there are all kinds of violence, so we have to take that into account. Yes. Thank you very much. That's an excellent answer, Remy. I think it's important to look at the different types of violence and to act according to the type of violence, because it affects different demographic groups. It's very important. Francesca, perhaps to conclude, there's a minute left. Would you like me to share some thoughts with you before you make your statement? To conclude, yes, if we could. Maybe just 30 seconds. Yes, just 30 seconds. I think it's important. It's been a very rich discussion, and what I've understood here is that there's a lot of overlap between the context and the programs to combat gender-based violence and the guides to comprehensive sexuality education when it comes to the root causes linked to norms and attitudes towards people. We must never lose sight of that, and we must make sure of that. The content is very important, but I think there are a lot of challenges to take up, and that's the application, the implementation of programs, particularly in terms of teacher training. Sometimes we have to be original, use other channels to make sure that we act, taking into account social media, other forms of technology, and I think that it's important to incorporate and combine the action of parents, school administrators, and others who need to play a role in localizing and adapting and engaging not only local community organizations, but also local authorities, the mayor's office, local administrative officials, and school officials. It's a lot of challenges indeed, but there are a lot of opportunities in the future to act in a concerted way. There are a lot of people who want to act, and technology could help us to take account of that. And I think we need to be able to act to meet these challenges, to implement. I could finish by saying that when we do all this work, we need to be able to continue to evaluate what works and what doesn't work. Francesca, I'll leave you the floor for your closing remarks. Thank you very much for your thoughts and for facilitating this discussion. So, we hope that the panel discussion has enabled you all to better understand the potential of integrating comprehensive sexuality education into the existing program, and to understand what investments need to be made, what actions need to be taken to integrate these different actions. I'd now like to make a request. We're going to ask you to take a few minutes to complete an evaluation survey. You'll see the link in the chat area. It's available in French, Spanish, and English. So, just take a few minutes to share your feedback on today's event, and it will be very useful for our team in planning other meetings in the future. Finally, I'm going to take a few minutes to thank. I'm very grateful to the panel moderator and all the panelists for their contribution to this important discussion. You've given us a lot to think about, and you've asked some very valid questions. Thank you very much for sharing your work with us. I'd also like to thank our colleagues at USAID for their support in planning this event. Also to Devin Degnan and my various colleagues who participated in this meeting, the members of the USAID Working Group, Isaac Clark. Thanks to the whole team for all their support and for allowing us to organize this meeting. To all participants, thank you for your support and active participation. Once again, please take just a few minutes to complete this survey, and thank you all for being here, and have a great rest of the day.